Chapter 1. Why do we get climate change so wrong? People are panicking about climate change, in large part because the media and environmental campaigners tell us to, because politicians overhype the likely effects, and because scientific research is often communicated without crucial context. Too often, the missing context is the most obvious fact of all. Humans adapt to their changing Earth. They have for millennia and will continue to do so. Any projection of the impact of climate change that fails to take this into account is not realistic. There are strong incentives to tell the scariest possible story about climate change. Media gets more clicks and views with frightening stories. Campaigners get attention and funding. Researchers who position themselves as addressing apocalyptic threats get outsized attention, more recognition for their universities, and more future funding opportunities. Politicians who emphasize the scary scenarios get to promise to save us, and in the process gain the authority to distribute significant resources to fix the problem. None of this means that we shouldn't worry about potentially big problems. We want researchers looking for the big problems, media highlighting what might harm us, and politicians saving us if we need it. But we should be appropriately skeptical because selling Armageddon is also really useful to all these groups. We should be skeptical of the media's coverage of climate change. Nearly every day we see news stories about rising temperatures and the extreme damage climate change will cause. Again, the media is rewarded for telling the most alarmist possible version of the climate change story. That's what will sell the most newspapers and generate the most clicks. Nobody clicks on a link titled, "Life in the future will be very recognizable, but could be somewhat more challenging in certain respects." And so instead, we read, in the words of one recent headline in the New York Post, "Climate change could end human civilization by 2050, report." It's highly unlikely that the journalist who wrote the article or the editor who came up with the shocking headline was setting out deliberately and carefully to mislead their readers. But the journalist and editor most definitely were trying to get more readers, and it's clear that they did not fully read or assess the study they reported on, much less vet it against the established science on the topic. The actual 2019 study on which the story was based is just a flimsy 7 pages from a little-known think tank and veers wildly from the accepted science of the United Nations Climate Panel. The report presents the most extreme and unlikely scenario in which all climate impacts are far worse than projected by the vast majority of scientists. Within that extremely artificial setup, which the report authors state is beyond their capacity to model or even quantitatively estimate, there would indeed be a high likelihood of human civilization coming to an end. But even then, the report does not set the date for the end of civilization at 2050, but only in some unspecified future. As one climate scientist described it, this is a classic case of a media article overstating the conclusions and significance of a non-peer-reviewed report that itself had already overstated and indeed misrepresented peer-reviewed science. In other words, both the report and the news story were more climate fiction than climate news. Yet, in various forms, this frightening story made it into USA Today, CBS News, and CNN, among many other major media news outlets. What is the media's problem with climate change? Of course, there is some careful, responsible reporting, but there is much more that isn't. Part of the problem is that over the past several decades, in an effort to seem balanced, many media outlets gave space to climate change deniers long after their arguments had been thoroughly debunked. More recently, deniers are not given space, and this is for the better. But some of the alarmist coverage now may represent an effort to compensate for past sins. Journalists are making the same mistake at the other end of the spectrum. They are failing to hold climate alarmists to account for their exaggerated claims. Take the June 13, 2019 Time magazine cover story. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, is photographed standing in a suit and tie with water up to his thighs off the coast of the tiny Pacific island nation Tuvalu. The accompanying article warns that rising seas threaten to submerge Tuvalu, and states bleakly that because it lies almost at sea level, any rise threatens to wipe Tuvalu and its 10,000 inhabitants off the map entirely. Alas, Secretary General Guterres ruined a perfectly nice suit for no reason. This is not what the science says. Yes, global warming does make sea levels rise, including around the more than 124 reef islands of Tuvalu. But it would have taken the journalist just a few minutes to find the latest scientific study of Tuvalu published in Nature. It confirms that not only has the sea level been rising, but around Tuvalu it has risen at twice the global average. Yet during the last 4 decades of strong sea level rise, Tuvalu has actually expanded and seen its total land area increase by 2.9%. This is a result of the process of accretion. Yes, sea level rise erodes and reduces land area, but at the same time, old coral is broken up by waves and washed up on low-lying shores as additional sand, which counteracts the reduction. The 2018 research shows that this accretion process is overpowering the erosion, leading to net land area gain for Tuvalu. Moreover, this process is ongoing, and its dynamic feature will likely mean that the Tuvalu Islands can, in the words of the Nature study, persist as sites for habitation over the next century. The Time cover story also warns that 2 other island nations, Kiribati and the Marshall Islands, will be wiped off the map. A few more minutes of research on both nations would have undercut the entire story. In Kiribati, 4 atolls all show natural accretion outpacing reduction since 1943. The main Tarawa Atoll, where half the population lives, has seen accretion increase the total land area by 3.5% over 3 decades, plus a 15% increase from major reclamation projects in South Tarawa. Similarly, the Marshall Islands have seen their total land area increase by 4% because of natural accretion. Indeed, in the latest research summarizing all these studies for Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, French Polynesia, the Maldives, and Tuvalu, it turns out that accretion has beaten out sea level rise on all atolls and all larger islands. Despite sea level rising over recent decades, all atolls studied have increased in area, and all the larger islands studied either remained stable or increased in size. A more carefully investigated story would have included information on accretion and land mass gain, and could have focused on the challenges facing people who need to move from areas of erosion to accreted land. But instead of looking at the real problems that nations like Tuvalu will face because of climate change, the Time magazine story is framed as Our Sinking Planet, more digestible, scarier, and more saleable, but also deeply misleading. A similarly scary story swept the world in 2019, this one told by the New York Times and many, many other media outlets, that vast swaths of inhabited area will be underwater by 2050, with cities erased. The headlines stem from Quality Research, a 2019 paper published in Nature that shows that past estimates of the impact of sea level rise have been wrong because they relied on measurements of ground level that sometimes accidentally measured the tops of trees or houses rather than the ground itself. This means vulnerability to sea level rise has been underestimated. That's important, but the media used this to focus on a dystopian vision of 2050. The New York Times presented a terrifying map you can see on the left of figure 1.1. The map shows which areas of South Vietnam are under the expected high tide waterline and potentially at risk. This figure estimates the area of South Vietnam below high tide water level. At the left, the map the New York Times highlighted for readers. The newspaper said it showed that by 2050, this entire part of Vietnam will be underwater at high tide. This claim ignores existing protection. Indeed, most of South Vietnam is already below high tide, and almost everyone is protected. On the right is the extra land that will be below high tide by 2050. Left graph reproduced with permission. Clearly, this looks scary, and the newspaper, in no uncertain terms, declared that it shows South Vietnam will all but disappear because it will be underwater at high tide. It told readers that more than 20 million people in Vietnam, almost 1/4 of the population, live on land that will be inundated. Similar effects were shown around the world. This news went viral. "Climate change is shrinking the planet in the scariest possible way," tweeted Bill McKibben, founder of international climate advocacy organization 350.org. Climate scientist Peter Kalmus said he was once concerned about being labeled alarmist, but news like this made him embrace the term. What did the media forget? To reveal what the comparative situation is today, and it is almost identical to the situation estimated for 2050. If you look at the map to the right in Figure 1.1, you can see how much extra land will be at risk in 2050. Almost none. Both maps simply show what everyone knows. People in the Mekong Delta literally live on the water. In South Vietnam's An Giang province, almost all land that is not mountainous is protected by a dike. It is underwater in the same way that much of Holland is. Large swaths of land, including Schiphol, the world's 14th largest airport, are quite literally built under the high tide mark. In London, almost 1 million people live below that level. But nobody in Holland, London, or the Mekong Delta needs scuba gear to get around, because humanity has adapted with dikes and flood protection. The actual research on which the New York Times article is based mentions in its introduction that coastal defenses are not considered in its approach. That's fine for an academic paper, but it's ludicrous for the media to use its findings to produce claims of 20 million people underwater, or for campaigners to suggest that this gives us reason to all become alarmist. The study shows that today, 110 million people are underwater regularly. In reality, almost every one of them is well protected. The real story here is the triumph of ingenuity and adaptation. In 2050, the study shows a global increase of 40 million people living below the high tide mark, 150 million in total. As we will see later in this chapter, almost all of these additional vulnerable people will be protected at a fairly low cost. The media didn't set out to deceive readers, but the news it shared was unnecessarily, unjustifiably alarming. The real news is that an increase of 40 million people living below the high tide mark will be a slight worsening of a challenge that we have shown ourselves completely capable of solving in a world that will be much wealthier and more resilient than it is today. Context matters. One of the most influential recent examples of the media's alarmist approach is its coverage of a major report issued in 2018 by UN climate scientists. Most news outlets reported that these scientists were urging the world to drastically cut emissions by 2030, with huge changes needed to keep temperature rises below 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit or 1.5 degrees Celsius. CNN told us, for example, that Earth has 12 years to avert climate change catastrophe. Versions of this story appeared in newspapers worldwide and have been parroted by politicians and activists ever since. In fact, what had happened was that at the Paris Climate Change Conference 3 years earlier, leaders from around the world had declared that they wanted to achieve the target of keeping temperature rises below 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. They even put that aim into the preamble of their Paris Climate Change Agreement. They did so at the urging of the campaigners who wanted to demonstrate their willpower and ambition, and not because the world's scientists had come together to declare this arbitrary cutoff point crucial. Having already declared in 2015 that the goal was to restrict temperature rises to less than 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, world leaders then asked the UN climate scientists to find out what it would actually take to achieve this incredibly ambitious target. The scientists' response became the 2018 report. The scientists, who have promised to deliver policy-relevant but not policy-prescriptive information, according to UN guidelines, obligingly said that the 2.7 degree Fahrenheit goal was technically feasible, but would require rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. Simply put, politicians asked them what it would take to do the almost impossible, and scientists responded that this would require almost impossible policies. Yet the report was presented in the media as evidence that we need to make urgent, extreme carbon emission reductions. It would be a bit like asking the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, what it would take to move the entire human population to Mars. NASA would obligingly tell us that it is technically feasible, but would require far-reaching changes to our current priorities and unprecedented investments in space technology. Campaigners would be similarly wrong in saying, see, NASA is telling us that we all need to go to Mars. This dramatic misrepresentation is crucial because claiming that we have just 12 years left is one of the reasons why children are striking from schools, cities and countries are declaring climate emergencies, and many people are even suggesting we consider suspending democracy to fight this existential threat. Some people have taken the report to mean that we must rein in temperature rises by 2030, or we will be on a trajectory that will eventually lead to the apocalypse. Others take it to mean that climate Armageddon is imminent if the problem hasn't been solved by 2030. Regardless, campaigners and politicians argue that because of the 12-year deadline, we should stop even discussing the cost of climate policy. If the world will end, surely nothing else matters. The media's role in promulgating apocalyptic narratives doesn't fully explain why views about climate change are so extreme on either side. Another important element is the fact that climate change increasingly has become a way to stand out to voters. I'm going to save you from the end of the world, and my opponent won't. The politics of climate change is increasingly becoming more partisan. In the United States, well into the early 1990s, opinion about environmental issues, including climate change, remained remarkably unified. As recently as 2008, former GOP House Speaker Newt Gingrich and future Democratic Speaker Nancy Pelosi filmed an ad for Al Gore's nonprofit organization in which they sat cozily together on a sofa, agreeing that climate action shouldn't be partisan. The era of good feeling has ended. Global warming is now being used, often explicitly, to advance broader causes in a partisan political environment that shapes the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and much of the world. This fact goes a long way toward explaining the heightened levels of alarmism that characterize the current conversation about climate change. Up until the 2018 midterm congressional elections, climate change was deemed such a peripheral campaign issue in the U.S. that there was not a single question about it in a general election debate. Things then changed very quickly. By 2019, CNN was hosting an entire town hall debate for Democratic presidential contenders framed entirely around the climate crisis. A partisan gap in attitudes has been fostered by both sides. Today, people who identify as Democrats and Republicans are further apart on how much priority should be accorded to climate change than on any other single issue. Just consider that. On gun control, the economy, the minimum wage, workers' rights, universal health care, foreign policy, immigration, and abortion, Americans are more aligned than they are on climate change. Democratic states, including New York, California, Washington, New Jersey, New Mexico, Nevada, and Maine, have all passed bills requiring carbon neutrality by 2050 or earlier. Being carbon neutral means carbon emissions have been reduced to zero or balanced out by reductions elsewhere. Republican states have not passed any similar legislation, and in 2019, the Republican Senate minority in Democrat-controlled Oregon blocked a carbon neutrality bill by literally fleeing the state to avoid a quorum. While Democrats have passed what will end up being incredibly expensive promises, President Donald Trump, with Republican support, has done the opposite. He wants to do nothing at all. Neither approach is right. The partisan divide in America is also reflected globally. Overwhelming concern about warming is worn as a badge of honor by leaders of other countries who want to highlight their differences from the Trump administration and its woeful lack of climate policy. Opposition to Trump has colored coverage of climate policy all over the world. In the wake of Trump's election, for instance, a number of high-profile media outlets began to publish stories claiming that China was stepping up as a leader on climate change. A leader on climate change? China has tripled its carbon emissions since 2000 to become the world's largest carbon emitter and has seen its renewable energy use halve from almost 20% in 2000 to about 10% in 2020, although it was even lower at 7.5% in 2011. According to official estimates, even if China implements all of its green promises, renewables will reach only 18% in 2040, with 76% of its energy use still coming from fossil fuels. Holding China up as a green leader is a false narrative that tells us more about the storytellers and often their opposition to Trump than it does about China. Setting artificial deadlines to get more attention is one of the most common tactics of climate change campaigners. If we don't act by such and such day, the planet will be doomed. In 2019, Britain's Prince Charles announced that we had just 18 months left to fix climate change or it would be too late. But this wasn't his first attempt at deadline setting. 10 years earlier, he had told an audience that he had calculated that we have just 96 months left to save the world. In 2006, Al Gore estimated that unless drastic measures to reduce greenhouse gases were taken within 10 years, the world would reach a point of no return. But we can go back even further. In 1989, the head of the UN Environment Program declared that we had just 3 years to win or lose the climate struggle. The UN summarized the threat: "We all know that the world faces a threat potentially more catastrophic than any other threat in human history: climate change and global warming." Really? More catastrophic than a potential all-out nuclear exchange? More catastrophic than the 100 million dead in 2 world wars in the 20th century? And more catastrophic than tuberculosis, which in the last 200 years has killed about 1 billion people? Nearly a decade earlier than that, in 1982, the UN was predicting planetary devastation as complete, as irreversible as any nuclear holocaust by the year 2000, due to climate change and other challenges, including ozone layer depletion, acid rain, and desertification. Even earlier last century, climate change was causing concern, though for a completely different reason. During the 1970s, while global warming research dominated the scientific community, a number of high-profile researchers promoted fear of a catastrophic oncoming ice age. Science News had a 1975 cover showing glaciers overwhelming the New York City skyline. Time magazine published the story "Another Ice Age" in 1974, suggesting that telltale signs are everywhere for cooling and that its effects could be extremely serious, if not catastrophic. Even if there was no ice age, the article told us, just a small drop in temperature would lead to crop failures, making human life unsustainable. The fact that we are worried about both cooling and warming does not mean we should not worry about either. The point is that the media likes to predict impending doom, preferably with a firm date attached. And there is something about human psychology that makes us want to believe it. One of the most striking examples of this apocalyptic tendency came in 1968, when a group of academics, civil servants, and industrialists met in Rome to talk about the seemingly insoluble problems of the modern world. It was a pessimistic age. The techno-optimism of the 1950s and 1960s had given way to concern on a broad range of issues, from geopolitics, the Vietnam War, to society, the Youth Rebellion, to the economy, unemployment, and stagflation. Newsweek summarized the mood with a cover showing a confused Uncle Sam gazing into an empty cornucopia and the words "running out of everything." In the same year that this Club of Rome was forming, the massive bestseller The Population Bomb warned that humankind was breeding like rabbits and gobbling up whatever resources it could find, essentially pushing our species into oblivion. Against this backdrop, the Club of Rome was determined to make mankind's predicament more visible, more easy to grasp, as one of the members recalled later. The think tank membership was convinced that all of humanity was doomed because too many people would consume too much, and we were about to kill ourselves and the planet with overpopulation, consumption, and pollution. The only hope was to stop economic growth, cut consumption, recycle, force people to have fewer children, and stabilize society at a significantly poorer level. The club came up with a report, The Limits to Growth, which was so influential that it was discussed in magazines from Time to Playboy, scrutinized by the commentariat, and seized upon by campaigners for radical change. The report had special appeal to the media and apparent extra intellectual heft because it was based on computer simulations, which were then revolutionary and ultra-modern. Applying these, the scientists predicted with great confidence that gold would run out by 1979, along with a huge range of important resources that humanity depends on: aluminum, copper, lead, mercury, molybdenum, natural gas, oil, silver, tin, tungsten, and zinc would run out before 2004. Spoiler alert, they were spectacularly wrong. Consider just the 4 most important resources. Since 1946, technology has made more copper, aluminum, iron, and zinc available than we have consumed, and commodity prices have generally fallen. Oil was supposed to run out in 1990, according to these thinkers and their computer simulations, and natural gas in 1992. But reserves for both are actually larger today than in 1970, although we consume dramatically more of each. Shale gas alone has doubled U.S. potential gas resources within the past 6 years and halved the price. No resource is infinite, but the resources that can be generated are still far beyond consumption. The Club of Rome got it wildly wrong because it overlooked the greatest resource of all: human ingenuity at adapting. We don't just use up the iron or gas that is there and then give up. We get better at finding more at lower cost, in effect allowing humanity to access to ever more and ever cheaper resources. The story of the Club of Rome is important because lots of people are making exactly the same mistake now when they study and report on climate change. They are leaving out our remarkable ability for adaptation. Much of the alarmism surrounding the topic can be explained by this one fact: the stories assume that while the climate will change, nothing else will. So, for instance, the Washington Post recently reported that sea level rise could be even worse than we've been led to expect, swamping an area similar to Western Europe and making 187 million people homeless. Not surprisingly, the notion of 187 million flooded people led many press stories, with Bloomberg News warning that coastal cities around the world were poised to drown, swallowed by the rising ocean. Obviously, 187 million makes for a large attention-grabbing number. Don't believe it. That figure is absurdly exaggerated, and it isn't even new. The headlines come from a 2019 scholarly paper whose authors simply repeated it from a paper published in 2011. What the earlier paper actually found was that 187 million people could be forced to move in the unlikely event that no one does anything in the next 80 years to adapt to dramatic rises in sea level. In real life, the 2011 paper explained humans adapt proactively, and such adaptations can greatly reduce the possible impacts. When adaptation is taken into account, the authors showed, the problem of environmental refugees almost disappears. Furthermore, the main consequence of a larger rise in sea level is a larger investment in protection infrastructure, and it is incorrect to automatically assume a global-scale population displacement owing to a large rise in sea level. Under realistic assumptions, the number of people displaced in an extreme scenario of high sea level rise falls from 187 million to 305,000. The worst-case flooding will displace less than 1/600th of the figure in the headlines. Journalists and others make this same mistake over and over, with massive consequences for the public's understanding of climate change. In his influential book, The Uninhabitable Earth, journalist David Wallace Wells states that coastal flooding caused by sea level rise will result in somewhere between $14 trillion and more than $100 trillion of damage every year by 2100. This idea has been repeated by countless climate activists, but it turns out that these figures exaggerate the problem by up to 2,000 times. Where do the numbers come from? Wallace Wells uses two key papers to support them. What these papers basically do is predict that sea levels will increase because of climate change over the 21st century, and count how many people and how much wealth in those areas will be flooded without additional flood protection. Do you notice what's wrong with that sentence? Yep, it's the final four words. The headline-grabbing costs come from modeling the effects of flooding without additional flood protection. And headline grabbing isn't an exaggeration. We will come back to the extraordinarily high claim of $100+ trillion. But first, let's scrutinize the 2018 research paper that came up with the $14 trillion cost. This was helpfully shared with the world's journalists via a press release. The figure found its way into Newsweek, Axios, Science Daily, New Scientist, and India Today. What no news stories mentioned, and indeed what the research paper itself barely acknowledged, was that even an extremely stingy amount of spending on adaptation would reduce costs by 88%, and that if we applied real-world, realistic expectations of adaptation spending, the reduction would be far greater. For climate change to cause $14 trillion of damage, we must assume that not a single country will ever increase the heights of any of its dikes beyond their present levels. They will steadfastly keep their protective walls too low, even as sea levels rise over the century, and even as these countries become much richer, as they will, and able to afford much more protection. The authors of the original paper acknowledged the lack of logic in this assumption, albeit in fine print. While the present analysis has focused upon the potential costs of flooding in the absence of additional adaptation from the existing baseline, it is clear that all coastal nations have and will continue to adapt by varying degrees to sea level rise. They even point out that standards of protection are likely to improve, particularly with economic growth, making the huge cost of funding even less defensible. Of course, that caveat didn't find its way into the press release. Some countries have adapted more successfully to climate change than others. Today, coastal cities in the United States have much higher expected damage costs than European coastal cities because they have much lower protection standards. Likewise, rapidly growing regions in developing countries will likely have a growing adaptation deficit because coastal development too often takes priority over investments in adaptation. But there's every reason to believe that, globally, adaptation will increase with sea level rise. Studies show that as societies see greater threats, they increase the height and number of protective dikes to reduce these threats. And the evidence also clearly shows that adaptation increases with higher incomes. This makes sense. At the same level of threat, richer countries can afford to demand higher dikes and more protection than poorer countries. Let's look at the second study that Wallace Wells relied on to reach the upper end of his estimate, the astonishing figure of $100 trillion or more. The highly quoted study examines the impact of rising sea levels with human adaptation and without. As you can see in figure 1.2, around the year 2000, about 3.4 million people were flooded each year. The total flood costs were $11 billion per year, and protection costs from dikes, levees, and so on ran to $13 billion per year. The study looks at outcomes based on multiple variables: different levels of sea level rise, population growth, and economic growth. The conclusion is similar across all variations, but let's focus here on what would happen with the highest sea level rise of almost 3 feet by the end of the century in a world with a rich economy that has much to lose. Number of people flooded over the century with high sea level rise, either ignoring or including adaptation. Cost in percent of GDP includes both flood and dike costs. If we don't adapt, catastrophe ensues. 187 million people will be flooded each year, and the flood cost will be a phenomenal $55 trillion annually, all in inflation-adjusted dollars. Since we're not spending any more on adaptation, dike costs go up only slightly to $24 billion. In total, flooding costs will make up 5.3% of global GDP by 2100 if we don't adapt. In the study's most extreme scenario, not shown in the figure, 350 million people could get flooded every year by 2100, with costs reaching beyond $100 trillion, or 11% of global GDP. This is where Wallace Wells got his high-end, terrifyingly large figure, the worst-case outcome of the worst-case, no adaptation scenario. But of course, we will adapt. As the authors of the paper put it, damages of this magnitude are very unlikely to be tolerated by society, and adaptation will be widespread. With realistic projections of adaptation, the number of people flooded will drop dramatically to about 15,000 per year by the end of the century. Yes, dike costs will increase to $48 billion, and flood damage costs will also increase to $38 billion. But the total cost to the economy will actually decline from 0.05% of GDP to 0.008%, and a 99.6% reduction in flood victims will be an undeniable victory. Far more than just making it into Wallace Wells' influential book, this study was quoted by many media outlets, without any mention of adaptation. The narrative that has repeatedly and consistently been told was that 187 million people would be flooded and trillions of dollars in damages would be caused. Humans have been adapting to nature for millennia, and with more wealth and technology, we will be even better at it in the future. Cutting carbon dioxide is not the only way for mankind to respond to climate change. Adaptation is also crucial. For many centuries, much poorer societies have adapted as sea levels have risen. And today, we have more know-how and technology than ever before. We can build dikes, surge barriers, and dams, expand beaches and construct dunes, make ecosystem-based barriers like mangrove buffers, improve building codes and construction techniques, and use land planning and hazard mapping to minimize flooding. As a result, deaths from storm surges have actually been declining even as sea levels have risen. If the fact of ongoing human adaptation to the environment is ignored, the inevitable result is a terrifying story that draws attention. But this portrait is highly deceiving. The reality is that while the amount of carbon dioxide emitted has a comparatively small impact on the number of people flooded, even with the largest carbon emissions and the highest sea level rise, there will be many fewer people flooded because of adaptation, especially in a world that is richer, and the whole world is getting richer, and therefore increasingly able to afford it. Even with rising seas, the most likely scenario is that in the future, fewer people will die from climate-related flooding, not more. We witness the same sloppy logic on the issue of heat waves. Let's examine a June 2019 headline in New York Magazine. Meeting Paris climate goals would save thousands of American lives during heat waves, study. The news story quoted a 2019 study saying that future heat waves so extreme they occur only every 30 years will, by the end of the century, claim a huge number of lives across 15 U.S. cities. But here's a very curious thing. That study assumes that nobody in those cities will manage to do anything sensible, like purchasing an air conditioner, for 80 years. So, for instance, the authors project significantly higher death rates over the course of the century in cities like Seattle, where only 34% of the residents have air conditioners. That some or all of the remaining 66% of the population might buy an air conditioner at some point falls beyond the imaginative range of the authors. The reality is that by the end of the century, most people in cities like Seattle will have bought air conditioners and built houses better able to deal with heat. Indeed, with technological developments, it would be logical to assume the air conditioning will be even better than today's. The city will also likely have invested in social innovations, such as cooling centers available for poorer people during heat waves, ideas that are already being used in places like Atlanta. Adaptations like improved standards and expansion of air conditioning already allowed New York to reduce heat-related deaths by 2/3 between the 1960s and the 1990s. France introduced reforms in 2003 that included making air conditioning mandatory for elderly care homes. As a result, by 2018, heat-related hospitalizations in France were lower than they had been in earlier, cooler years. And Spain cut heat-related deaths between 1980 and 2015, even while average summer temperatures rose almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 degree Celsius. So what happens if we account for the fact that people will, in fact, respond as people always have? Well, it turns out that even with much higher temperatures, toward the end of the century, total deaths caused by extreme heat could actually fall by 17,000 across the United States. A headline rewritten for accuracy would read, "Thousands fewer Americans will die because of air conditioning. Paris Treaty not relevant to story." Once the human propensity for adaptation is taken into account, the numbers on climate change start looking a lot less scary. And adaptation should always be factored into any climate change study because humans are always adapting. One reason why people are afraid of climate change is that when you watch the news or read the paper, the weather increasingly is portrayed as frightening. Surely climate change is costing us more money and lives? What about the hurricanes ravaging coastlines from Florida and Puerto Rico to Samoa? What about the massive floods and terrifying droughts across the world? These disasters seem to be getting worse and worse every year, right? Wrong. The reality is that these weather events, both in number and severity, have stayed the same or even declined over the past century, as we will discuss in Chapter 3. However, the cost of these events is getting much higher for reasons that have little to do with climate. A hurricane or flood hitting a sparsely populated Florida in 1900 would have done relatively little damage. Since then, the coastal population of Florida has increased 67-fold. Thus, a similar strength hurricane or flood hitting a densely populated, wealthy Florida in 2020 leads to much higher costs. The higher cost is not because hurricanes changed, but because society changed. This is a well-known phenomenon called the expanding bullseye effect. Similar climate impacts will result in much more costly disasters because an increasing number of people with more and more valuable assets are at risk. The expanding bullseye effect can be thought of as an archery target with the rings showing population density, telling us how many people and possessions are at risk of being hit by an imaginary arrow or natural disaster. See Figure 1.3. The rings enlarge over time. This means it becomes ever more likely for an arrow to hit the target. The risk of a huge disaster increases. Illustration of the expanding bullseye effect. As a city keeps growing over time, adding more and more expensive housing, an identical flood will have a bigger impact. Thus, the cost of the flooding in 2040 will be much, much higher than in 1950, even though the actual flood event is the same. Let's look at a real-life example of this. Flooding. One 2017 study looked at Atlanta from 1990 to 2010 and found that the number of exposed housing units on its floodplain increased by about 58% in just 20 years. This means that with the same amount of flooding and all other things being equal, Atlanta in 2010, on average, would have seen 58% more housing units flooded than in 1990. Houses in 2010 were also bigger and more valuable than in 1990, so the financial losses would be even higher. Similarly, a hurricane charging through downtown Miami in 1940 would have wrecked 24,000 homes. The same hurricane hitting today would destroy about 1 million much more expensive homes. In 2100, it is estimated that a similar hurricane could ruin 3.2 million even more expensive houses. The expanding bullseye effect means we're likely to see much more costly disasters happen over time, even if the climate doesn't change at all. This does not mean that global warming has no distinct impact, but it does mean that when the media trumpets that the latest hurricane, tornado, or flood is the costliest yet, they tend to imply that the rising damage is due to climate change. In reality, much, and often all, we're seeing is that more people with more stuff live in harm's way. It is no wonder that people are scared about global warming, given how the media covers it, how campaigners pound it, and how politicians get to grandstand and promise our salvation. Yes, global warming is real, and it needs our serious attention, but the endless jeremiads have warped our understanding of the issues. We need a better sense of what global warming will actually mean. Right now, we're getting lots of irresponsible journalism that's scaring us rather than informing us. We need to end the sensationalism and get a grip on the real size of the problem by including information on adaptation and the expanding bullseye effect. As I will argue later in this book, we also need to stop believing that any story with climate in it is best solved through climate policies. As we will see when we are told about the hundreds of millions of people flooded because of global warming, the argument easily becomes we need to save them with carbon cuts. But we will find out how little that would help. We will see that even if we went all in and spent hundreds of trillions on climate policies, sea levels would still rise only slightly less than if we did nothing. Millions would still get flooded. If we instead went all in on adaptation, we could, for less than 1/100th of the cost, save almost everyone. The same with heat deaths. Focusing on climate policies costs vastly more, yet helps much, much less than air conditioning. Only when the screaming stops will we finally be able to identify the most effective ways to both address global warming and actually help people with their real-world problems.